Okay. So you're ready, Alex?
Yeah.
So we can start. So we are in a joint Sedra, Matot-Massei, and what I'm going to take you through is a Sikha from volume 4 of Likutei Sikhs. I'm saying this for the machine. It's the first Sikha on Matois, and it sounds as though it's going to be a bit irrelevant to you because the content of this Sikha is about vows, making a vow.
Mm-hmm.
And few of us make vows, and few of us would, if we did make a vow, recognize the importance of it. And what people don't know until they begin to learn Chabad Hasidus and the Rebbe's Torah in particular is that really what we're talking about with a vow is a deep, deep spiritual energy. And that spiritual energy is very strong. It's we'll see why in a minute, but and in order to understand it, we're going to have to, I'd like you to understand it as background music, that we're going to be talking about the following energies. We're going to be talking about the energies of good and bad, of holiness, kedusha versus klippa, unholiness, and at the end of the and really at the end of the spectrum of this, pleasure and pain. So, and these forces are forces that we're all familiar with, we all live with, we all get it. We spend your life running after pleasure and avoiding pain. If you have any sense, you're doing that. All of us are interested in, Jews are interested in kedusha, whether they can manage to get there or not, we'll see in a minute. But you have to know that every Jew is a believer. When a Jew tells you he's an atheist, don't believe him, he's lying. Put him in a plane when it's going down and he'll be saying Shema along with everybody else. There's no such thing as a Jewish atheist. What there is his distance from kedusha, and that can often be environment and education and lack of opportunity and all sorts of conditions. But it's important in the 60, 70, 80 years, 120 years that you're alive, that you have an ability to tune in to holiness, because at the end of the day, that's one of the big jackpots, as we'll see in a minute. But ultimately, all of that is predicated on good and bad, on good and evil. What is evil and what is good? Let's define it now so that we get it over and done out of the way, and we go through this very often. Good is that which is consistent with Ratzon Hashem, that which is consistent with the will of God. What is bad? That which is not consistent with good and bad, with the will of Hashem. So those energies are background music to what we're going to be talking about. What we're going to be talking about is in a nutshell, is this, that is there a television on or a noise? There's a lady outside?
Yes. You want to close the door?
The door is closed.
Door is closed.
The door's closed. I don't know. Okay. So yeah, maybe something
Next.
cooking outside. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So we're going to start with this. we have a piece of Torah which says that you have to make yourself kodesh in any pleasure that you pursue. So everybody knows that Jews have a nefesh habahamis and nefesh elokis, a godly soul and an animal soul. We share our animal soul in terms of its vigor with all the animals in the animal kingdom. All of the animals in the animal kingdom, including humanity, who aren't animals, but we have a nefesh habahamis, react to pulling away from pain and trying to access pleasure. Normal. That's a normal physical drive. That is really disturbing me. Do you mind if I fix it? No, I don't. I think it's upstairs. I'll just pause this for a second. So, we have a rule. We have a piece of Torah that says that a Jew has to make his pleasure kodesh. Has to be careful that his pleasure is kodesh. And that means limiting one's pleasure. That's not good news for most of us. Most of us find that very bad news. And we need to explore that, because against that we have a piece of Talmud in the Talmud Yerushalmi, which says this, that there are enough restrictions that God places on us without us adding to them. Who asks us to add to them? If there are restrictions that God has imposed, that's one thing. But who are you to say, I want to minimize my pleasures? God gave pleasures. Enjoy them. What do you mean minimize them? First of all, who gives you the right to minimize them? And two, what's the purpose of minimizing them? So, working backwards, the purpose of minimizing them is this, that we have a principle in all Torah that you can't have Kedusha and Gashmias functioning at the same time. They are not, except for exceptions that I'll come to in a minute. You can have a glass full of liquid, right? The liquid can be water or it can be wine. It can't be both all water and all wine. It's got to be either. So when we are pursuing pleasure, physical pleasure, the risk is that our focus deviates from and leaves our perspective of Kedusha. That's the problem with it. On the other hand, the counter-argument, or the counter-proposition to that is, but God gives these pleasures, so who are we to ignore them? And as always, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim haim, which means that these and these are the words of the living God. So both are true. It is true that we have to limit our pursuit of pleasure, and it's also true that there must be a reason for that pleasure and a pathway to use that pleasure, which is for the benefit of you, your family, mankind, and the whole of the world. So we need to understand the distinction from those two things. Why do we need to understand that? Because at the end of the day, a Jew doesn't want to live like an animal. It's clear to all of us that we seek pleasure and we avoid pain. But for those people that spend their life, and we were talking about it before, if those people who spend their lives simply tuned into maximizing gratification and minimizing pain, it's not enough. It's not enough for a Jew. Because he gets to be 60, 70, 80, and standing at the side of the hole at Rookwood, and he's got nothing to take with him. Whereas a Jew who's lived a life tuned into his spirituality leaves with the Torah and mitzvahs that he's done during his lifetime. Now, the way that you limit access to pleasure. Well, before we get to that, let's just define this. Most ignorant people equate pleasure with happiness and pain, suffering, with unhappiness. It's a normal thing to do. We've talked about this already. It's the nefesh habahamis, it's the animal soul, and the animal soul is reaching for pleasure and reacting against pain. And so it's very easy to slip and think that pleasure equals happiness, pain equals unhappiness. But let's take a couple of examples. My wife tells me, and I'm sure your wives have told you, that childbirth is the worst pain that exists. Right? I think kidney stones are in there as well. But childbirth is the... But ask... There are 8.5 billion nefoshos on this planet, so 4.25 of those are women. Ask those women, would they give the baby back? They wouldn't give the baby back. They suffer the pain for the purpose of great happiness, not for unhappiness. So the pain doesn't cause unhappiness. The pain is a part of the fact that they become happy. What about pain and unhappiness? Sorry, what about pleasure and unhappiness? They go together as well. Not all pleasure gives happiness. As I often say, ask a heroin addict. You ask a heroin addict and he's used to having a lot of pleasure, but you're telling me he's happy? They're enslaved, poor men, women, children. So the issue really is, what are the dimensions of what we're talking about, and how does it apply to you and me? And ultimately, how does it apply to you privately in your relationship with your God? Because that's what learning Hasidus is about. That's the reason we pursue this learning, to discover the boundaries of our, and these are currents in our lives that we're all familiar with. And Nebuch, the saddest thing is that people can live a lifetime without ever really investigating these things and never coming to any conclusions which they can work with and live with at a practical level. So the way to limit your pleasure seeking, and we haven't yet decided that it's a good thing, except that it's a piece of Torah that says you have to make your pleasure kodesh. The way to do that is through what's called precious, which means separation. You make a vow, and you say, for example, you're overweight, and your Yetzer Hara is chocolate. So you make a vow that you're not going to eat chocolate for 60 days, 90 days, 120 days, until you lose that weight. Now you make that vow, and you stick to that vow, and that if you do stick to that vow, the restraint that you bring to bear has a benefit to you. We're talking about a physical benefit. But with spiritual matters, the restraint doesn't just lose weight physically. It introduces, it limits the klippa, the opposite of kedusha, the opposite of holiness, and brings into the world, we'll see this in a minute, more light that gives you access to more Kedusha. Now, when a person is involved with Gashmias, physicality, to a very large extent, that eclipses him being involved with spirituality, and often vice versa. You know, not entirely, but the other side of it is much truer, that when a person is involved in physicality, it's difficult to have a perspective of Kedusha, unless you take a vow to limit let me give you, let's take some examples. Let's say that now, before I do that, I want to explain that these vows that you make really are fences around an obligation. So let's say, for example, that there is an obligation not to be promiscuous sexually. There's no children at this table. I can talk openly to adults. So let's say that a person has ordinary functional lust, and let's say that he accepts the halakha about who he can sleep with and who he can't, when he can sleep with them, when he can't, etc. In order to cater for the fact that we don't pretend, like, say, the Catholic Church, that you can be without any sexual partner for your whole life and nothing's going to happen. It doesn't mean that you're going to end up buggering children or all the things that happen with them. Judaism says having sex is a natural, fundamental part of the mitzvah of Peru Veru, and it has to be embraced, and it has to be enjoyed, and you have to say thank you to Hashem for the fact that you can manage it, or whatever it is, and that you're married, and you have a wife that you love, and whatever. But there are limits to those pleasures. Why? Because if you go beyond those pleasures, those limits, you're outside of the halakha. You're outside of the halakha, you've lost the kedusha of the mitzvah of Peru Veru, with which comes, incidentally, the pleasure. So, you make a vow. What does it mean you make a vow? The Rabbonim put fences around it. And that fence is not the mitzvah itself, it's a fence around the mitzvah to help you and me behave, in inverted commas. In other words, you and me to utilize the spiritually positive part of the issue and reject the negative and unhelpful part of the issue. And don't forget, you can't rely on the pleasure or the lack of the pleasure, because that'll take you wrong. So that's why the Rabbonim made fences around the Torah. We'll see in a minute when these started in the second base up in Tosh. But let me give you an example of a fence. So there's we have the laws of what's called yichud. Is everybody familiar with that term? Or if you're not, let me explain. Yichud means that you're not allowed to be isolated with a woman who is not your wife or your child. You're not allowed to be isolated. So you can't be, for example, in a room. I have an office. I'm a religious Jew. I try and keep the halakhas that I can. And I'm a lawyer. I've been seeing clients in my room for 60 years. Some of them have been women. Some of them have sensitive material that they don't want the staff to hear, right? So I can't, and the the fence is that if she comes into my room, I've got to leave the door open. That's the fence around being secluded with a woman who's not your wife or daughter. So there can be massive practical problems with that. You learn to deal with them, and there are a whole lot of people. You're not inventing the wheel here, so there are lots of ways to deal with it. I'll give you another example. We don't shake hands with a woman who is not your wife or your child. You're not allowed to touch another woman who's not your wife or a child because of the laws of yichud. So, for example, especially today, I mean, not when I started to be a solicitor, but today a woman walks in the room and says, "How do you do?" Now, what do you do with that? Yeah. And when Rabbi Feldman first came to Sydney and was beginning to make Jews more frum, somebody spread a vicious libel that the reason we don't shake a woman's hand is that she may be having her period, and if she's having her period, Jews aren't allowed to touch her, which of course is a myth and it's wrong. So this became a very big problem practically. There were Rabbonim that used to wear gloves, for example. But these are fences around the Torah. Now, the logic of them, each one is different, and so on. There's a true story. There's a true story about a bocher in Europe before the war. They used to have, the bochrim were very poor in yeshiva. The yeshivas were poor, the bochrim were poor. And they used to have Essentag, they used to have eating days in people's houses. And this bocher stayed in an old Jew's house, not only eating there, but he slept there and went to yeshiva during the day. So, this guy, the old man who owned the house, had a very old cleaning lady who used to come once a week or whatever it was, and so for that period this bocher one day was there at the time that the cleaning lady came, and he wanted to go and get cigarettes. And it was middle of winter, so he asked the old rabbi, does he mind if he goes down the shops to get the cigarettes? That was a few miles away, so he decided to jog or walk or run, whatever it was. And when he came back with the cigarettes, he sees the old rabbi standing outside the house in the freezing cold, shivering in his overcoat. And he's shivering and he's freezing. And the boy says, "Rabbi, why aren't you inside?" So the rabbi said, the cleaning lady's inside. And the bocher says to him, "Rabbi, are you serious? You're 90, and she is super ugly. So I'm sorry to say it's one of God's creations, but she's terrible looking." So what are you doing standing outside? And he says to the bocher, "Bocher," he says, "with my Yetzer Hara, I'm 20 and she's beautiful." Mm-hmm. And it's a very important, deep story, because the reality is we all think that we're outside of this. It doesn't apply to us. I'm old, she's ugly, whatever it is. The reason we have these fences is because they are necessary if you want to live a life which is consistent with Torah and mitzvahs. You say, mate, well, most of the time I'm not. Most of the time I want the pleasure. But it's a false goal. It's the goal that really, at the end of the day, doesn't give you anything, doesn't enrich you, doesn't enrich anything around you. And the worst thing is, we're going to see in a minute, assuming we get time, that the problem with doing anything contrary to Ratzon Hashem is it introduces into the world, not only into you and me when we do it, but into the world, it introduces a negative energy, a negative spiritual energy. The amazing thing that nobody, if you told this to 99.99% of people that you ever meet and that for the rest of your life, they'll laugh at you. But if you have to understand that there is a mutual, common responsibility amongst humanity to live right, to live in accordance with the Ratzon Hashem. And when we don't, we introduce negative energy. And that negative energy can cause earthquakes, it can cause premature death, it can cause misery, it can cause all sorts of things. And you then say, well, why would God do that? That's a whole other story, and we haven't got time for that at the moment. But so just at this point of time, it's necessary to understand that it should dawn on you for the first time maybe in your life, and if it's that, then, or if it's not the first time in your life, you've got to practice it more. It should dawn on you that you need to have boundaries to your physical gratification, because that impinges on your spiritual gratification, on your spiritual activity. So, and it's very difficult when you're talking about, and most vows, you should know, limit gratification. That's what they're about. You don't make a vow on something. I don't need to make a vow that I'll never eat Brussels sprouts. I hate Brussels sprouts. You couldn't get a Brussels sprout down me. So I don't need to make a vow about Brussels sprouts. But chocolate's a different matter. And everybody has their Brussels sprouts and everybody has their chocolate. And that's true at every level. That's true with money, it's true with power, it's true with glory, it's true with sex, it's true with every physical level of gratification that you get. The question is, what's the value of it, and what part of it do you have to stay away from? And that's very difficult. And you know, what makes it even more difficult, that you can't be a judge in your own cause. We have a rule in Torah, I think we did it last week or the week before, that if the judges, we did it recently, gets bribed by wiping off a feather, and he says that he's bribed and he can't sit in the case because he's. So one of the things you can't do, al pi halacha, is be a judge in your own cause, because you're biased. And that bias is sufficient to render a bad judgment. So here we have, try to explain the enormity of this problem, that on the one hand, we have the Yerushalmi, which says, how dare you minimize pleasure? That's what God's given you. On the other hand, you have the piece of Torah that says you have to make your pleasure, be limited to your pleasures being kodesh. And what does that mean? It means you have to vow not to go into forbidden waters. How do you do that? You make fences around the Torah. And then you have the problem of whether you're going to keep those fences or not. And it depends on how strong your Yetzer Hara is and how much training you have to see that what seems delicious is actually, let me take another example, which is less carnal. People love Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara is delicious. You know what the Gemara says about Lashon Hara? It's honey dripping off the fangs of a snake. That's how the Talmud describes Lashon Hara. And you go to anybody's place for Shabbos lunch or Friday night dinner or whatever, at Shabbos lunch, and someone says, by the way, did you hear about Chaim Yankel?
Yeah.
And everyone leans in. Right? Everyone leans in. It's precious. What you're going to hear now is precious to you. And that you can't be doing yourself, the people around you, or Chaim Yankel, who you're talking about. It says three people suffer: the teller, the listener, and the subject of the. And there's a whole lot of learning on the teller. I understand, the listener I understand, but what about the person who? What about Chaim Yankel? What's he done? He's not even here. And there's a whole lot of Chassidus on that. We haven't got time to do that now. But what I'm saying is that take a thing like Lashon Hara and put yourself in judgment of that and ask yourself, how often do you actually not lean in and leave the table? And I saw an absolutely beautiful example of this. We went to somebody's house for a Yontif meal, and somebody began talking about somebody. It wasn't as blatant as "Did you hear about Chaim Yankel?" But it was Lashon Hara, whichever way it is. And the people in the house had a 8-year-old child who went to Kesed Torah, and this little kid said, "You're talking Lashon Hara," and everyone stopped, and they pulled themselves up, and it was very interesting that this little kid brought them to their senses. Right now, the purpose of the vow is to take the place of the little kid. The purpose of the vow is to say, there comes a point at which I can't talk about this any further. Even if it's delicious, even if the gossip is delicious, and there are times when, especially I remember there was maybe 15 years ago, there was a very famous Rav in Yerushalayim. It caused great embarrassment to the Jewish community, particularly the Frum community, because he was having, he had serial affairs or relationships with, he used to sit outside the mikveh and look through a hole. I can't remember the story, and he was a Frum Yid. And when this story broke, people were outraged and very disappointed and all the rest of it. And so it can happen to anybody. Now, does that mean that you have to persecute the guy and I don't know what you do with him, but the one thing we do have to do is to learn the lesson for ourselves. The fact is, these breaches of God's laws bring with them two things. They bring a positive energy when you're successful and a negative energy when you're not successful. And the positive energy when you're successful is massive, absolutely massive. You just have to try it, and you'll see that you feel the energy, you feel the empowerment, you feel the strength and self-control. You feel the strength that the self-control brings. You want to question why that is so? Well, then you learn Chassidus. But the first step is to start learning some boundaries and know what to, and we're so careful with these boundaries in Halakha that you can't imagine. I mean, Shulchan Aruch tells you which shoe to put on first. You know that? You have to put your right shoe on first. And if you have laces, you have to tie up the left shoe's laces first. So you put on the right shoe, you have to tie up the left shoe's laces, and you say, are you serious? It makes any difference to God, who runs 400 billion galaxies with all those planets and all of that's going on, that you and I have a trillion genes all working together, getting everything right automatically. When you eat, your mouth produces saliva. You don't have to concentrate to do it. It just does it. Your teeth chew the meat. It just knows how to do it. And all of that's happening, the whole world's running beautifully and wonderfully like that. And you tell me that it matters a damn to Hashem whether you put on the right foot first and tie up the left shoelace first. But it matters very much. You know to whom? Not to God, but to you and me. You have a private discipline which encourages your immediate conversation with your God. And when you put on the right shoe first, it's going to be habit sooner or later, but it's a beautiful habit. You know, when a Jew leaves a house and kisses the mezuzah, or comes into the house and kisses the mezuzah, it's like a little kid. It's like your daughter or granddaughter leaving your place and kissing Zadie goodbye, or coming to your place and kissing Nana hello. Why do they do that? Because they love their Zadie and they love their Nana. Why do we kiss our mezuzah? Because we love our God. And the relationship that we have with our God is ultimately both physical but also spiritual. Now, you can't have the spiritual relationship with your God if you're violating the the physical boundaries that Hashem has imposed on us. Now, tell you something else that's disappointing. When do you need the fences most? When it gets darkest. When it's light, you don't need fences. So it says that man was created to be straight. A man who is straight doesn't need the fences as badly as a man who's all over the place. And the historical example of this is that in the days of the first Beis Hamikdash, when manifest godliness was obvious, we had 10 miracles that every Jew could see every day that he walked into the temple. Open godliness. When in the temple there were miracles that were being repeated all the time and obvious to everybody. After the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, most of those miracles disappeared. So I'll give you an example. One of the miracles was that the luchos were a certain size. We've been through this many times. Let's say there were 10 amas, 5 amas. They were cubes, not like you see in the Goisha pictures. They were cubes. And let's say that they had 5 cubes, whatever the measurement was, 5 cubits cubed and 5 cubits cubed, because there were two luchos. So that means that they were 10 cubits long, correct? And they were 10 cubits wide, because they were cubes. But what happened, and they were in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but if you measured them from the wall to and the room was 20 amas. So the room was 20 amas, 5, that's 10. So the maths is that it was 5 amas from the wall to the aron, to the. So you had wall, 5 amas, this of the first pair of luchos, another 5 amas to the wall, correct? So when you measured from the wall to the luchos, it was 5 amas. And on that side, 5 amas. Altogether, 10. That's what it should have been. What happened when you actually measured it with the measuring tape? It was 10 amas to the first luchos, and then 10 amas to that. In other words, the luchos took up no space. Is that possible? How could it be? So in the first Beis Hamikdash, there were open miracles like this. When the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed and the second Beis Hamikdash was built, those miracles ceased appearing. When those miracles ceased appearing, that means there's less godliness obvious in the world. And for the first time, the Rabbonim began to put fences around mitzvahs. Why? Because there was more darkness in the world, less light, less godly light. The more darkness there is, the more fences you need. And when you understand that whatever we're learning applies in a macrocosm and in a microcosm, it applies generally speaking, but it applies to you and me individually. So how does it apply to you and me individually? The darker you are, or darker I am, the more I need the fences. The lighter you are, the less you need the fences. This old Jew who said that he was 90 and she was with his Yetzirah, she was beautiful. He was a very fine man, but he recognized that in this regard, he lives in a certain degree of darkness. You recognize you live in a certain degree of darkness. You need the fence more strongly than if you don't. And I'll give you an example. If you spend your days working in a synagogue, I'll give you an example, cleaning Sifrei Torahs, going to 3 minyanim a day and making the Kiddush on Shabbos, and that's where you're involved. It's less likely that you're going to fail with a woman than if you're down in one of the clubs where I don't know where the clubs are, but where naked ladies are dancing. You're going to fail more there than you are in the synagogue. Why? Because there's more darkness there than there is in the synagogue. Why is that darkness? Because it's not consistent with Ratzon Hashem. Are we saying it's not beautiful? No, we're not saying that. Are you not saying it's not tasty? No, you're not saying that. But are you saying that that's Ratzon Hashem? No, it's not. Therefore, it's darker, and the darker it is for you and me, the more that we have to subscribe to the fence. And it's very interesting that when a person judges in his own cause and gets it wrong, the standard reaction is, oh no, we're more sophisticated than that, come on. I'll give you another example. You know, it's very common, particularly in France, I mean, it's also become common here, it wasn't so common when I was a boy, but people walk into each other's houses and they kiss each other on this cheek and on the mwah, and if you stop them and you said, how can you do that? You can't touch a woman who's not your wife. They would say, oh, come on, we're too sophisticated for that. And that's the very person that needs the fence. The person that believes that they are so sophisticated, they're really echoing the fact that they live in darkness. The person who acknowledges it and has a much better chance of not needing the vow. Okay, so can we just summarize this, that the vow itself is necessary to limit the clipper, but it increases the positive energy into your life and into your environment. Now, we need to learn this together, and it may surprise you. What do you do if you make a vow and you feel you don't need it anymore? I'll give you an example. First time we went to Israel, I just fell in love with the place. And when we had to go, I said to Anne, next time we come back here, I'm staying here. That's what I told her. And I really meant it. Now, when you say that, that's a vow. Whether you mean it as a vow or not, if you make a resolution like that, that has the category of a vow. And a Jew is not allowed to break a vow. I forgot to say this at the beginning. If you make a vow, you are bound by that vow, unless you're a woman, and if the woman is underage, her father or if she gets married, her husband can annul that vow. But an adult male human being makes a vow and he's stuck with it. That's why when you ask somebody, I'll meet you here tomorrow at 2:30, and he will say, yes, Bli Neder. Why does he say Bli Neder? I'm saying I'm making a commitment, but I don't accept that is a vow, because the word for vow in Hebrew is Neder. So Bli Neder means not with a vow. So when you say verbalize, and you have to verbalize it, if you verbalize an intention, you have to know that you have to be very careful with that, because you're stuck with that. Unless what? Unless you get the vow annulled. So before Rosh Hashanah, we sit there and we have a process where we annul all the vows that we've made for the year, so that we can go into the new year clean of any vows. What does it mean and how do you annul a vow? An ordinary person, I'm not talking about a woman and fathers, but let's say that you vow never to ride a motorbike. And now you want to ride a motorbike for some reason. So you have to go to a Beis Din or a Hokum and get that vow annulled. To get a vow annulled implies that you are at a higher level than when you needed the vow, correct? So if you are granted an annulment of that vow, it means that you have increased in your spiritual position to the point that you don't need that vow anymore. Otherwise, they're not going to release you. So I'll give you an example. When I said to Anne, next time I come to Israel, I'm staying here, and I told my very old friend 50 years ago, Rabbi Philman, about this. I said, the next time I'm going, he said, be careful, you're making a vow. And when I finally went to Israel a couple of years later with Anne, Rabbi Philman was good enough to me as a friend to ring me and say, by the way, I remember you told me that you said that next time you're going to Israel, you're going to stay there. You have to have that vow annulled before you go. And I went to a Beis Din and I had it annulled. A Beis Din of 3 Jews. Why? Because whatever the perspective was that make you make the vow, if you've grown out of that perspective and that can be recognized, then you don't need the vow anymore. But what's really happened, more light has come into your life. The reason you needed the vow was you had a certain amount of negative energy. Do we see that negative energy? No. Do you measure that negative energy? No. But you know that this is, you are saying something, you're taking upon yourself a position, and you're stuck with that position. Now, if the vow is undone, that means that the stuckness has gone. You have a Yitzias Mitzrayim from that vow, and that's a new level of freedom. And now that comes with a whole lot of new responsibilities, and new spiritual responsibilities, which can be very exciting. And to live one's life ignorant of all of this, it's very easy. It's easy to spend your whole 120 years and none of this ever occurred to you. But if you do learn it, and if you do learn to start living with it, so that the Bli Neder isn't just a formula, but that religious people use when they say, yes, I'll meet you at the corner of such and such, and he says Bli Neder, you should know that you're listening to something really holy. You're listening to something where a person is saying, I have a spiritual perspective as well as a physical perspective. I get it that I'm entitled to pleasure from the physical, but it needs to be within boundaries. And I am the one who controls the boundaries. I'm the one who controls the boundaries to the extent that if the boundaries to be lifted, I go and I seek that lifting, and I'm in charge of getting that thing changed. And a person has a private dialogue with his God with this. So let's go back to pleasure. We all want the pleasure, and none of us want the pain, and that's very legitimate. But the pleasure has to be in accordance with Ratzon Hashem. Now, let's define what that is. Finally, we get to this point. If you eat, it's pleasurable. Right? All animals love eating. Most people love eating. When you eat, why do you eat? That's the question. If you and I eat with a moment's thought on the focus that we are eating in order to feed our guf, to give us strength, to learn Torah, do mitzvahs, elevate the world.
Say a bracha.
Huh? And say a bracha before, say a bracha afterwards. Then we are doing something holy. And the pleasure from the food is not only legitimate, but it's mandatory. Right? But if you eat because you want to trick up the food, people go to restaurants and wear different clothes, listen to different music, the food is a pleasure which is an end in itself. That's why you eat, for the pleasure. Then you're in darkness. That's the reality. You need to make a vow that you won't eat that food for 30 days or whatever it is. And what happens if you keep that vow is you have become energized to reject that clipper, and you and your body and your environment grow and become invigorated by that choice. This is very difficult because it's not scientifically provable. I can't prove to you that if you eat for the pure joy of eating, like any glutton, there's a preferable way of eating. Because if you ask a glutton, he doesn't care. He's eating for the pure pleasure of eating. Now, if you do that, you're missing out on half a life. You're missing out on the half of the life which is a gratitude for the pleasure and an enjoyment of the pleasure as a byproduct of the mitzvah. If the mitzvah is peru veru, of being fruitful and multiplying, the pleasure has to be a byproduct of that mitzvah. If the pleasure is sought out for itself, and if the pleasure is, and this makes everybody uncomfortable. You think I'm no different. I'm just giving the share, no different to everybody else. But to pursue a pleasure purely for the pleasure's sake is not giving you any real highs. On the contrary, it's giving you negative forces. But if you pursue the mitzvah that has the pleasure, then you're entitled to enjoy the pleasure as much as possible. So that's the actual rationale of the two opening statements. One statement is to make your pleasures kodesh, and the other is, who are you, says the Talmud Yerushalmi, to limit God's pleasures? Well, here's the answer. The answer is, if the pleasure is secondary to the mitzvah, then you know that it's healthy. If the pleasure is the primary reason you're doing it, and the rest of it can go to the rubbish bin, then you know that you're abusing it. And need a vow. So, l'chaim.
John.